good morning. My name is Cunningham. There's like, which one of these things is not like the other in this room? And that's me. I am not an economist. I am a researcher by training. I work at the Urban Institute. I'm the vice president for the Metropolitan Housing Community Center there, where I run a center of about 80 researchers and policy staff. So we tend to focus on a range of issues from homelessness, eviction, public housing, housing vouchers, discrimination in the housing market, to broader issues like community and economic development, climate change in communities, and so on. I am here to bring a policy perspective to this conversation, and I have been doing work in my career on the housing voucher program. I've been involved in, I actually started my career off as a caseworker for families with housing vouchers, and have done a lot of research on housing vouchers. One of the big pieces of research, which I'm actually not going to talk about today, is on discrimination against voucher holders. And then more recently, been doing a lot of work on homelessness and looking at how homelessness programs work. And I'm not going to talk about that either, but I would encourage you to look at some of the work that we've done on housing first and supportive housing and what it means as a solution to homelessness. Today, I'm actually going to talk about the broader housing market and give you some perspective on what we're operating in, and also really think about, look at housing insecurity, and then call for more empirical work on trying to think about market failures, regulation in the market or deregulation in the market. I'm going to talk a little bit about land use and zoning, and then more investments. How can we design social programs so that they're politically palatable? So I'm hoping you can all solve my political problems when I'm thinking about, does this really work? And especially in an environment where evidence isn't always the first thing that people look at on the Hill, and in other places in the policy environment. So let's start by talking about what's going on in the housing market. Housing costs have grown significantly. They're growing faster than incomes. I think we all know this. This is looking at both the US median home values and incomes, as well as specifically DC, because we know that particularly in major metros, that spread between income and housing costs is really bigger. But that is a nationwide problem. And what we know is part of it is that housing is not keeping up with demand. This is housing starts per 1,000 households. We know that not only do we not have enough housing production to keep up, the supply isn't keeping up with demand, but we also know that most of the housing is really concentrated in single family homes. And so if you're thinking about renters, if you're thinking about low and moderate income people, you're really not talking about the market that we currently have, which is really focused on single family homes. The other challenge here is that when there is multifamily development, it tends to be much bigger buildings. Usually a lot of the development now is on the sort of luxury side, 2 and 4 unit buildings, and even 5 to 19 unit buildings have been on the decrease. That's the blue and the yellow lines. And then the black line is 20 or more units, which is a little bit increasing, but really, generally speaking, those small units, small buildings that are really what make up the affordable housing stock are on the decline. So what does that mean? It means that we have a nationwide shortage of about 7.3 million rental homes that are affordable for extremely low income renters. And so, and this is actually National Low Income Housing Coalition's map. It does a really nice job of breaking this out by state. So I would encourage you to go and look at it. But what it tells us is that, voucher recipients, people who are facing eviction and homelessness are really operating in a market that's not set up for them at all. They're competing for scarce units. They're also facing significant discrimination in the market from landlords. So public subsidies generally in the US have been on the decline. That's especially true for deep subsidies. We have public housing and housing choice voucher programs. Some people know it as the Section 8 program. Have public housing in particular has declined because we've been demolishing public housing units and really vouchering out those programs. There has been some investment in low-income housing tax credits, which is really a private market program to incentivize landlords and developers to actually produce low-income housing. That produces only about 100,000 units a year. So this is just to give you a sense of what our housing market looks like compared to other housing markets. Places like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, major metropolitan areas. The units with either project-based subsidies, those are the blue, or private market subsidies, tenant-based subsidies, housing vouchers, more specifically, is a really small portion of the market. So under 10%. When you look at places like France and the UK, you see a much bigger portion of the market actually has subsidy. So 20 to 35% of the people who are in those markets are actually receiving some kind of subsidy. So we have a pretty tight rental markets across the country, especially in major metropolitan areas. We have low housing supply and not enough units. It's sort of like a game of musical chairs. This is a sort of example or analogy that a lot of people use, which is like at the end of the day, the people who are left standing without housing are usually the most vulnerable, who can't compete with other people in the market. So I have 3 million eviction filings per year. I think that's actually an update from the Eviction Lab. When he talked about some of the challenges with eviction data, I think this actually represents not a new number. It's like, no, I think it's actually, there's new data being added, more geographies. And so you're just actually adding, there's no denominator there. So about 1 million of those households are evicted. So there's, obviously a big difference between filings and the actual eviction process. This particularly affects kids, but it also particularly affects women of color. Black women in particular are affected by the eviction crisis. Homelessness was actually, I've done a lot of work on homelessness. I used to feel really optimistic. I think it's a solvable problem. I think we actually have evidence-based solutions to solve for homelessness. We just have not scaled those solutions, and we haven't invested in those solutions. So right now, homelessness is around 600,000 overall at a point in time. That's a snapshot that communities take usually in January. There are many more people who experience homelessness over the course of the year, about 1.5 million. That's sort of the movie, not the snapshot. Homelessness was going down until about 2015 because there were significant increases in investments. Congress made significant investments in ending veterans homelessness, so funding actually a version of housing vouchers for veterans. There was significant investments in supportive housing, and the numbers actually started to go down. So I felt very optimistic because both the data on the program effectiveness was lining up with the population level estimates of some of those numbers going down. More recently, though, we have seen an increase in both chronic homelessness, so people who have been homeless for long periods or who have a disability, and as well as unsheltered homelessness. If you live on the West Coast, I'm not telling you anything new. There has been an explosion in visible homelessness and encampments across many of our major cities and even in some of our suburbs. So I want to take a step back because I talked a little bit about housing supply and how it's not keeping up with demand. I want to talk a little, and I've talked a little bit about the sort of grim consequences of that. I want to focus on what are some of the things that actually explain our housing deficit. The first that I'll point to are strict local land use regulations. So locally, jurisdictions make decisions about land use, often through planning boards, but also there's both detailed policies that you go through, but there's also sort of informal processes that often are used to make land use decisions. And that is why we have what we have in terms of mostly predominantly single family homes. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have inadequate financing options, especially for low and moderate income households. So even if you are a developer and you want to develop housing for low and moderate income people, it actually doesn't pencil out for you. It doesn't make financial sense. You can, because of all the costs associated with the entitlement process to go through land use and zoning boards, because of the construction costs, what you can get at the end of the day for rent doesn't really pencil out to be able to pay back your debt that you're going to take on. So there really is a market failure there, which is that there is this demand that people need housing, and for landlords, they're really not incentivized to actually develop that housing. And then I talked a little bit about limited government subsidy to sort of correct for some of those people who are really left out of the market. So in terms of land use and zoning, which I see as a really fundamental roadblock, I'm actually not a land use and zoning expert. I have researchers in the center. Yona Freemark is one of them. I don't know if anyone knows Yona, but who does a lot of work on this. And, but I more and more have started to think, if I really want to encourage more housing for people who are experiencing homelessness or evictions, I have to get back to a bigger level to start to think about things like land use and zoning, because we have places, and this is a great New York Times analysis that basically shows that in some locations, upwards of 95% of the land that is zoned for single family use only. So you can't, it is actually illegal to build apartments in these locations. And that is a major roadblock to getting housing developed. I think most of regulation for this market is really distorting the market. It increases costs. It limits options for people. So if you want to, say you live in a neighborhood, my mom lives in a neighborhood right now, it's a single family home. She wants to actually age in her town. She wants to buy a condo. There are no condos for her to buy. So it's not only an issue of, are there apartments and condominiums for people who are low and moderate income? It is an issue that goes across income and ages. It also exacerbates segregation. So one of the reasons why voucher holders cannot find units in opportunity areas is because literally when you look at those maps of Bellevue and Redmond, there are no apartments. There are very limited apartments. And so really being able to find units in those locations is a very competitive process. There are also environmental and climate consequences to land use and zoning because it encourages car use. And then what I really focus on is making, it makes alternative different types of units, even things like accessory dwelling units, difficult to build. So I am feeling a little bit optimistic, but not totally optimistic about the recent wave of land use and zoning reform. So there has certainly been places, Maine, Minneapolis, more recently, the Puget Sound region, Arlington County and Virginia, where they are passing a wave of land use and zoning reforms, but these have been pretty slow, and there's only probably a dozen of places that have passed significant reforms. And some of these look like upzoning, reducing parking requirements, allowing different types of structures, also by right development. So these are some of the waves of land use and zoning reforms. So I'm going to talk a little bit on my last slide about what some of those land use and zoning reforms might present for for research for all of you. But I want to first also just note that the other reasons why we don't have significant we don't have actually enough housing for folks is because we need significant investments in all sorts of housing programs. We need investments in not only public, and people now say social housing. I don't even know what that actually means. I think that just means subsidized housing. It's like a rebranding of public housing, because people, when you say public housing, everyone says, we're not doing that again. So now people say social housing. You know, there is, I think, a real need for universal housing vouchers. There's political challenges to that. Certainly, Congress has not shown a great appetite for expanding the voucher program. But there's also, I think, market challenges with that. If you flooded the market with subsidy, where there, you know, how do you actually design the adoption of a universal housing program and allow for a market absorption so that you wouldn't be increasing rents and really distorting the market. So the other is increases in low-income housing tax credits, but I also think we need to experiment with other ways to stimulate and incentivize housing production. So I had to put this slide in because I think often people ask the question of me, why is there little federal investment in housing? And I will say first and foremost, it is not understood as a market failure. People stigmatize poor and moderate income people. It's more of a risky person, bad choices model. And so instead of saying, hey, we actually don't have enough units in the housing market, they say people have made choices and have risky behaviors that result in them not having housing. Certainly, there's a relationship between having mental health challenges, substance use disorders, and other things that make people more vulnerable in a competitive market. But we also know that from the evidence that if you help a person pay the rent, that they actually can stay housed. And for people who have serious mental illness, we know that if you actually combine rental assistance with supportive services, that they can stay housed. And so it's not a question of whether or not the housing works or not, or their personal challenges. It really is whether or not we have the right level of subsidy for people who are not competitive in the housing market. And then the last thing is that housing is often viewed as a reward and a wealth building tool, and not meeting a basic needs or a fundamental right. And so it is really viewed as something that we give to people who have earned it, and not as something that people deserve or that we want to make sure everyone has. So this is, you probably hear some frustration in my presentation. This is me sort of taking a step back from a lot of the research that I've done on housing vouchers, on homelessness programs, on eviction, and trying to think about how can we reimagine the housing market. One, I think there is a big question of how do we get to a more momentum and actually nationwide land use and zoning reforms. I think there's questions around not only government incentives that Winnie raised, but also, are there ways to compensate current landowners, homeowners who are really the people who show up at those planning boards? Is there a way to actually create a market where they're interested in actually zoning reform? So I think that's a question. But I also think we need to know what the impact of these reforms are, because this is really a fundamental first step to creating more housing. It's illegal now to build multifamily housing in most places, but just changing the laws doesn't mean that you're actually going to have the market respond. So we really need to know how to incentivize that market. And then the questions around how can we really address market failures for low and moderate income households through government intervention. I think that there isn't a lot of political support for public housing and housing choice vouchers programs. I've done this work for 20 years, and there hasn't been any significant increases. So are there different designs to programs that are more market oriented, that are more politically palatable? Tax credits, other different approaches. What share of the housing market that we have should be subsidized, or I don't use this word a lot, decommodified, because it usually is pretty inflammatory. And what are the best mechanisms for subsidy delivery? And I don't know, I think Winnie did a great job, a much deeper dive into how to think about some of the market design issues in some of these questions. But I will say that we are really at an unsustainable place now with the housing market. Not only are low and moderate income people having trouble affording housing, but middle income people as well. People who are young and want to break into the housing market and buy their first homes is really challenging. And we just need to reimagine what the housing market looks like, because otherwise we're just really tinkering around the edges. That's it.